start out here. What is the statement meaning? Continuing availability of carbon depends on carbon cycling. That is all of our animal bodies and waste and plant bodies. So we got, any kind of living organism, so plants and animals contain carbon. And if we don't re-release that carbon back out in the environment, we're not going to be able to incorporate that because we are carbon-based. So life is based on carbon. So we need to cycle it and reuse it, or else we're going to run out. And remember, nutrients are limited. I guess a better way to say that is we don't get more from outer space. What we have on Earth is what we're going to have, so we need to recycle them. So need to be recycled. Okay, and remember, light we continually get, but nutrients, what we have on Earth is what we have, and carbon is the main nutrient that life needs in order to survive. So, autotrophs, plants, we know they take carbon dioxide from the air and convert into one of the main molecules that we need is carbohydrates. And one of my favorite, lipids, okay, aka fats, and carbohydrates, aka sugar, which we all, fat and sugar together, that's what makes food so appealing. And taking that carbon out of the air, making a chemical, is called carbon fixation. And we can't do that, but plants can through photosynthesis. So the average global concentration of CO2 in the air is 0.039, or 390 parts per million. That's something we've been using, like in the lab today, with the like copper, chromium, nitrate parts per million. Now we're above 400, so probably around 405 today. But it always goes up and down by about 3 to 9 parts per million seasonally, higher in the winter time for us in the northern hemisphere and lower in the summertime, because there are, and we showed it, I showed you a map of the world, we've got a lot more plants in the northern hemisphere. Excuse me. Whew. And that creates that imbalance. We saw in that diagram, CO2 levels kind of go like this over time because of that more plants in the northern. All right. Carbon can dissolve and make this hydrogen carbonate. So let's look at that. CO2 can mix with water, which means it's soluble. Dissolve, and another, when a molecule spreads out through a medium, is called diffusion. So it can diffuse into water, from the air into the water, and it can make carbonic acid, which is what you have, say, in soda, like a can of Coke. You open it up, drink it. It's acidic, and part of that is carbonic acid, also phosphoric acid, especially in terms of Coca-Cola. And this lowers the pH of the water. Once you have that, lowers the pH. And it can break apart further, hydrogen and this bicarbonate, and it's a little redundant. That water becomes more acidic. And these autotrophs can be in the atmosphere or the water. Okay, they need that CO2 in order to perform photosynthesis. And from the air or the water in terms of kelp or seaweed or phytoplankton. So maybe put that down. Kelp is a huge one, but not as really big as phytoplankton. A lot of our food chains are completely dependent on phytoplankton, taking that energy from the sun, providing that basis of the marine food chain. And let's see, the CO2 goes out of the organisms and into the atmosphere, and that's from aerobic cellular respiration. We get CO2 like humans. Okay, that's what we do mostly. And produced by plants, mostly in the roots of the plants make that CO2, but other cells as well. Animals like us. And this is, can you guess, things like bacteria or fungi, saprotrophs. All right. And methane. Methane is something we think of in the flatulence of organisms, including animals, including humans, and that accumulates in the atmosphere or in the ground. So, the bacteria, two types of bacteria. Some make organic acids or alcohols. Hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Use these organic acids to make acetate carbon dioxide. And this a third group. So you have regular bacteria, and then you have really old bacteria. Really old, probably 3 billion years ago they came about. But they make methane. And these archaeans, these ancient bacteria, live in the mud along shores and lake beds, swamps, wetlands, and we have a few wetlands over here, Dominguez Gap and DeForest. There's a new set of wetlands we're going to be studying later. And something you see, houses with a big circus tent around them, they're trying to kill all the termites. And they have a gut organism inside their gut that release methane. Cattle and sheep. And then landfills. We used to have one near Whittier, but it closed. That was the closest landfill we had to us. Now it goes probably 100 miles out towards Riverside. But this is where we bury our garbage. Okay, some of which is organic, and that makes the methane. Oops, forgot the E right there. Methane. Methane goes out into the atmosphere and creates a layer, well, it diffuses in, and it traps heat in the lower parts of the atmosphere. And it stays there for about 12 years. Eventually oxidized and is released or comes out of the atmosphere. That explains why we have low concentrations, and I need to follow up. I don't know what the concentration is. It's probably like something like that, or 1 part per million or 1 part per billion. So I don't know if you've heard of peat before, but in English literature, peat bogs or moors is a big thing, and they use peat to burn, to cook with, to heat their house. And you have organic matter, and it doesn't really decompose, and it turns, because of the acidic nature, and it eventually turns into coal, as we'll see in a second. But the water does not drain, and saprotrophs like bacteria can't break down the carbon and then recycle it. And the development of that, this is lower pH conditions, slows down those saprotrophs. And a thick layer of partially decomposed organic matter accumulates. So just over the years, you got more peat, which is a plant, building up, and not decomposing. Those are called peat bogs. And if something falls into there because of that low pH and the saprotrophs aren't working, the fungus isn't working, it can be preserved for a long time. You'll see these are some specimens of humans. Actually, this is Tollen man that was found in Denmark in 1950. Sorry, I didn't mean to cross it out. So 400 years BCE, and they thought he was a human sacrifice. He had certain contents in his gut and his position and the way he appeared to be killed. It looked like it was ceremonial. But that's pretty good. Look at that face, you know. So that's over 2,000 years being preserved because of that low pH acidic condition, which I think maybe the acidic conditions would eat it apart, but instead it helped preserve the skin. And fossil fuels we'll get to, they from about 300 to 400 million years ago. Coal comes from these peat bogs, which is really, really old peat that's been buried under a rising seas, worldwide. And then that contributed to that reduction in decomposition. And here, oil and natural gas formed in the mud of the bottom of the seas and lakes. So decomposition, I can't see this because of the video part, is incomplete. So coal from peat bogs, oil from the bottom of seas and lakes. So that's interesting to think about, and that affects that composition that we see. You pretty much, well, you may never have seen oil before. I'm not sure if I've seen crude oil, but it'd be similar to motor oil. But here's a nice diagram showing you the progression through time, getting buried. And it's kind of confusing because why is it on land? Well, eventually through plate tectonics, this area gets pushed upward, and therefore the elevation rises and is above the sea. Eventually, it can be thousands of feet above sea level. You can have these layers of coal that show that it once was underwater, which is amazing. You'll see all sorts of marine organisms in here. And again, powerful display of plate tectonics. And here's a nice diagram showing, again, 300 to 400 million years ago, coming up into the present day, how everything falls and gets buried over time, eventually uplift. Maybe put that uplift. Yeah, plate tectonics. Mark your slide with that. That's important. Now, most of you learned that during 6th grade. I think it's fascinating how continents move around. Pangea, the Tethys Sea, if you remember, south of India. In fact, India crashed into Asia, and India is really the fastest moving continents of all time. It actually was attached to Madagascar about, I think about 10 million years ago, and within a million years it flew across or moved across the Indian Ocean and then crashed into Asia. And just amazing. Nobody really knows why it moved that fast. Anyway, combustion. We burn. We love digging out this fossilized organic matter, the oil and coal, and burning it. It's great. It burns well and releases heat and CO2 and water. Okay, there's water being released. We see forests and grasslands get adapted to the fires, and they really work well. They function best when there's periodic fires. And you might not know it, but there is a lot of lightning that hits the ground, and that creates natural fires. And we also like to clear it for agriculture, clearing fields, growing things. In the tropical areas, grapes are grow because of the sunlight, the water, and there is a lot of, unpopulated areas that can be used. But plant oil palms is a big thing right now, and we get into climate change. It's a big driver what they're doing to a lot of tropical areas, clearing it out, burning it, planting the oil palm, which can be a problem, having that much land being destroyed to make that. And cattle ranching is a big one too. Cattle ranching. And we know that's a problem because of the methane that's released, plus the habitat destruction. And even wheat farmers in the United States burn their fields, and that helps to fertilize it for next season. Helps to fertilize for the next season. And forest fires, we mentioned this before. Look at all these trees burned in an instant, but all these get turned into ashes. And guess what that is? That's fertilizer. That's great fertilizer. So it's all ready to go for the next season. And all this smoke, guess what it has in it? Nutrients. Carbon, phosphate, nitrates. So phosphates, nitrates, NOx, POX, NO3, NO2. That's why we put the X there. So phosphates, nitrates, and then there's carbon, okay, and carbon dioxide being released. So those can spread around the world and then fall, in the case of carbon, being brought in by other plants and help to grow new plants in other places. Pretty amazing. So mollusks, building reefs, making limestone. So mollusks, clams, and then snails, you've seen those. And they have a hard shell made of calcium carbonate. Same thing that coral reefs are made of. And the soft parts, like the insides, decompose. The hard parts, just a second.